The brass oak leaf felt heavier than I expected. Not physically. The thing barely weighed anything clipped onto my dress uniform. But I kept touching it at red lights like I needed proof it was real. 10 years in Army logistics. 2 deployments. 1 broken engagement. Hundreds of nights eating vending machine pretzels under fluorescent lights while tracking fuel shipments and medical inventories nobody else wanted to deal with. And somehow that little piece of brass still surprised me. I left Fort Liberty at 5:18 that morning with a gas station coffee balanced between my knees and enough nervous energy to make me miss my exit near Raleigh. My mother had texted me 3 times during the drive asking what time I'd arrive. No emojis. That usually meant she was already stressed about something before I even got there. The Hayes family specialized in stress the way Italians specialize in pasta. By the time I pulled into their subdivisions outside Richmond, the sky had already turned that soft blue-gray color right before sunset. Every house on the street looked identical. Trimmed lawns, decorative shutters, garage refrigerators full of Costco meat nobody ever cooked. My father believed neighborhoods were personality tests. I parked behind Chloe's white Range Rover, which still had temporary tags on it. The thing probably cost more than my annual base salary. I grabbed my overnight bag from the trunk and noticed 2 cases of Veuve Clicquot sitting beside the front door through the glass panel. That should have told me everything. The second I walked inside, I heard laughter exploding out of the dining room, crystal glasses clinking. My father's big salesman voice carrying over everybody else's like he was working a showroom floor again. "Sarah's here," my mother called out from the kitchen. Nobody answered. I stepped into the dining room and immediately felt underdressed despite wearing a damn military uniform. Chloe sat at the center of the table in a tight cream-colored dress that probably couldn't survive a normal meal without legal representation. Her hair looked professionally done. Her makeup looked expensive in that subtle way rich people like pretending is expensive. And sitting beside her was a silver ice bucket full of champagne. "Look who finally made it," Chloe said. "Fort Liberty let you out early?" She smiled when she said it. That was the dangerous part about Chloe. If you didn't know her, you'd think she was joking. Dad barely looked up from carving the roast. "You missed the first toast," he said. Mom rushed over and kissed my cheek quickly, like she was already distracted by 6 other things. "Sit down, sweetheart. Chloe has huge news." Of course she did. I sat at the far end of the table while my father launched into a story about government contracts and medical supply chains like he personally negotiated the Treaty of Versailles. Chloe interrupted every 30 seconds to mention numbers louder than necessary. $4.2 million. Federal distribution partnership. Expansion opportunities. Scalable infrastructure. I'd spent enough time around Pentagon contractors to recognize corporate nonsense when I heard it. Half the phrases coming out of Chloe's mouth sounded copied from LinkedIn posts written by men who wear loafers without socks. Then I noticed the watch on her wrist. Rolex Datagist. Gold and steel. Probably around 13 grand. My father caught me looking and grinned like he personally built the thing in Switzerland. "Not bad for 30 years old," he said proudly. Chloe lifted her wine glass. Aramed's officially moving into the big leagues. Everybody drank except me. I still had half a glass of water sitting untouched beside my plate. Mom finally looked toward me. "You said you had news too?" The room got quiet for maybe 2 seconds. I set my fork down carefully. "I got promoted last week, Major. That was it. No speech, no dramatic pause. Just the truth sitting there between the mashed potatoes and the asparagus casserole." Dad kept carving. He muttered. For a second, I honestly thought he hadn't heard me. Then Chloe smiled politely. "That's nice. Nice. 10 years of military service reduced to the same response people use when you bring store-bought cookies to a party." Dad finally looked up. "What does Major even change?" "More paperwork. A little more responsibility," I said. "Government ladder climbing," he laughed. "You people promote everybody eventually." Mom gave him a soft look. "Arthur." "No, I'm serious," he continued, pointing the carving knife toward me. "Chloe's out here building an actual company. Real money, real risk." Meanwhile, Sarah gets another title and a brass pin from taxpayers. The room laughed lightly except me. And honestly, part of me expected it. Dad leaned back in his chair. "No offense, sweetheart, but military promotions are basically charity steps. Stay long enough, and they hand you another stripe or leaf or star. Oak leaf. Not stripe." But correcting him felt pointless. Chloe took a sip of champagne and glanced at my uniform. "Do they at least give you a pay bump?" I almost laughed. There it was. The Hayes family translation system. Every achievement converted directly into dollars so my father could understand it. A small one, I said. Dad nodded toward Chloe. See? That's the difference. Chloe creates wealth. The funny part was he said it while sitting inside a house my mother inherited from her parents. I cut another piece of roast and listened to crystal glasses tapping together around me. Somebody turned the dining room dimmer lower. Chloe started talking about leasing a second warehouse near Norfolk. My father looked at her like she'd personally cured cancer. Meanwhile, I kept noticing little things. The watch. The designer heels kicked under her chair. The way Chloe answered detailed questions with buzzwords instead of specifics. The way my father repeated her phrases 5 minutes later, like he suddenly understood logistics. I spent most of my career managing supply routes into places where one missing shipment could get people killed. You learn to pay attention to details fast in that line of work. And something about the entire night felt overinflated. Like watching somebody build a mansion out of cardboard. Mom finally asked if I wanted champagne. I looked down at the brass oak leaf on my chest for a second before shaking my head. I'm driving back tomorrow. Dad smirked. Army doesn't trust majors to drink now. No, I said calmly. I just like knowing exactly what's in front of me. That landed harder than I intended. The table went quiet for a beat, before Chloe laughed it off and reached for the bottle again. My father followed her lead immediately. Mom pretended to rearrange serving dishes so she wouldn't have to look at anybody. Same family dance. Different music. I finished dinner mostly in silence while everyone else celebrated money that technically hadn't even arrived yet. Chloe kept checking her phone every few minutes. Dad kept refilling glasses nobody needed refilled. And somewhere between dessert and coffee, I realized something that sat heavier than the brass oak leaf on my chest. Nobody at that table actually cared what I had become. They only cared what could be displayed. The loudest sound in the room was my silence. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Have you ever worked yourself to exhaustion just to realize your own family only respected things they could post online? And if you've ever been treated like background noise because your success didn't look flashy enough, subscribe to the channel. Trust me, this story gets uglier before it gets honest. The smell of burnt coffee was already sitting in the kitchen when I came downstairs around 7:10 the next morning. My mother stood at the counter in fuzzy slippers stirring powdered creamer into a mug like she was trying to dissolve stress itself. Dad was reading business headlines on his iPad with the volume somehow turned all the way up despite nobody watching the videos. Chloe walked in wearing sunglasses indoors. That usually meant either a hangover or confidence. With Chloe, honestly, it could go either way. Well, she said, grabbing bottled water from the fridge, since Major Hayes is in town, maybe I should give her the grand tour. Dad lit up immediately. That's a great idea. I kept eating my toast. Of what? My warehouse, Chloe said. The Norfolk expansion site. She said it casually, but I noticed the tiny pause before warehouse, like she enjoyed the word too much. Dad pointed his coffee mug toward me. Might finally show you what real operations look like. I almost smiled at that. I'd spent 4 years managing emergency supply movement through Kandahar during a sandstorm season, where helicopters landed looking like powdered donuts. But sure, let's go see the magical warehouse. An hour later, we were driving through an industrial district south of Richmond, where every building looked like it either stored auto parts or hosted illegal poker games after midnight. Chloe's new facility sat between a plumbing supplier and a discount flooring distributor with a flickering open sign that clearly hadn't worked since Obama's second term. The sign outside read, Hayes Ford's Distribution. The lettering looked fresh enough to still smell like adhesive. Dad parked beside the loading dock and spread his arms dramatically. Not bad, huh? The building itself wasn't the problem. I've seen ugly warehouses run flawlessly. I've also seen beautiful ones collapse under their own paperwork. The second Chloe unlocked the side entrance, I felt something shift. Not emotionally, logistically. Warehouses talk if you know how to listen. This one was screaming. The air inside smelled wrong first. Too clean in some places, too dusty in others. Actual active distribution centers have movement baked into them. Cardboard, diesel residue, heat from forklifts, human traffic, noise. This place felt staged. Dad walked ahead proudly while Chloe explained inventory turnover rates, like she memorized phrases from a TED Talk 30 minutes earlier. I looked at the pallet rows. Half the labels didn't match. One pallet marked medical-grade nitrile gloves had shipping stickers from a furniture wholesaler in Tampa. Another listed emergency respiratory supplies, but carried a barcode format usually used for consumer electronics imports. Then I noticed the forklift tracks. Dust. Not fresh dust either. Thin gray buildup sitting untouched inside tire grooves. Nobody had moved half this inventory in weeks, maybe months. Dad slapped one of the shelves hard enough to shake it. This is where the magic happens. The metal rattled for 3 full seconds. That shelf was practically empty. Chloe kept walking fast like movement itself could replace details. We're scaling aggressively right now. A lot of back-end integration. Corporate language is fascinating when you actually understand operations. It's basically camouflage for people who hope nobody asks follow-up questions. I stopped near a stack of boxes pushed against the far wall, 14 feet high minimum, too high for the weight distribution they supposedly contained. I pressed 2 fingers lightly against one carton, barely any resistance, empty. Not completely empty maybe, but close enough. Something wrong? Chloe asked. No, I said calmly. Just observing. Dad folded his arms. Military inspection mode? I ignored him. Instead, I crouched near a receiving pallet and looked at the customs declaration tags attached to the shrink wrap. Different handwriting styles, different date formats. One tag used military time. Another used standard AM/PM. A third listed country of origin abbreviations that Customs and Border Protection stopped accepting almost 2 years ago. That got my attention. Real supply chains leave fingerprints. Consistency matters. This place looked like 3 different people built fake paperwork separately and prayed nobody would compare them side by side. Chloe kept talking. Once the Federal Health Partnership finalizes, we'll probably expand into Atlanta too. Probably, not definitely. Interesting. I stood back up slowly. Who handles your customs compliance? She blinked once. Excuse me? For imported medical supplies, I said. Who verifies chain of custody documentation before intake? Dad groaned immediately like I'd asked somebody to solve calculus at brunch. Chloe smiled too quickly. We outsource portions of that. To who? A third-party logistics affiliate. What affiliate? She crossed her arms. Why are you interrogating me? I kept my tone neutral. I'm asking normal compliance questions. Dad stepped in before she answered. Jesus Christ, Sarah. She invited you here to support her, not audit the place. I looked at another pallet. Shipping dates didn't line up with intake records. More math problems. Where are the products sourced from? I asked. Chloe answered instantly this time. Too instantly. Multiple global partners. Which countries? Depends on the quarter. That wasn't an answer. Dad laughed loudly. You hear yourself? Nobody talks like this outside the army. Actually, they do. Especially federal investigators. I walked farther down the aisle while Chloe trailed behind me, explaining scalable procurement ecosystems with the confidence of somebody throwing random puzzle pieces into the air, hoping they land completed. Then I saw the loading dock schedule board. 6 outbound shipments listed for the week. Only 1 dock had fresh tire marks. Interesting again. Even the staffing felt wrong. 3 workers standing near shrink wrap stations pretending to stay busy while watching sports clips on a phone. No active scanning stations, no organized intake flow, no dispatch urgency. It felt less like a distribution hub and more like a movie set trying very hard to look productive. Dad noticed my expression immediately. There it is, he muttered. What? The jealousy. I turned toward him slowly. You really think this is jealousy? You've spent your whole life following rules while your sister actually built something. There are moments where arguing becomes pointless because the other person already decided what reality means to them. This was one of those moments. So I stayed quiet, and honestly, that bothered Dad more than if I'd yelled. On the drive back, Chloe kept talking about expansion plans, while Dad nodded along proudly from the passenger seat. I watched warehouses slice past the window and replayed numbers in my head automatically. Inventory volume versus visible movement, staffing versus claimed output, storage ratios, import inconsistencies, federal contract scale versus operational capability, nothing aligned. And when numbers stop aligning, eventually somebody with a badge notices too. I rested my elbow against the door and watched Chloe's reflection in the windshield as she smiled through her own story. The dangerous thing about fraud isn't greed. It's how quickly people start believing their own math. My phone started vibrating across the metal nightstand at exactly 11:47 p.m. Not ringing, vibrating. That low, angry buzz that instantly tells you nobody's calling to ask how your week's been. I rolled over inside my barracks room at Fort Liberty and stared at the screen long enough to consider ignoring it. Arthur Hayes flashing across your phone before midnight usually meant one of three things. He was drunk, he needed money, or Chloe had created a problem big enough to become everybody's emergency. I answered on the fourth vibration. What? Dad skipped hello completely. Finally, he snapped. Jesus Christ, Sarah, do you mute your phone on purpose? I was asleep. Well, wake up because your sister needs help. There it was. I sat up slowly and checked the clock again while grabbing my glasses off the table. Across the room, my laptop still glowed from the inventory reports I'd been working on that evening. 6 pallets of delayed medical equipment were currently stranded outside Savannah because somebody at customs entered the wrong tariff code. Real logistics problems never sound glamorous. Dad lowered his voice suddenly. That alone made my stomach tighten. There's an audit. I leaned back against the wall. What kind of audit? Routine vendor review, he said quickly. Government paperwork nonsense. In the background, I could hear Chloe talking over somebody. Fast, irritated. A television was running somewhere too loud. Dad continued. They're delaying the second funding release until they verify compliance documentation. There it was again. Compliance. The word people suddenly hate once rules apply to them. What does that have to do with me? I asked. Another pause. Then Chloe's voice cut sharply through the speakerphone. We just need you to vouch for us. I closed my eyes for a second. No, you didn't even hear the details. I heard enough. Dad sighed dramatically like I was already ruining Christmas somehow. Sarah, stop being difficult for 5 seconds and listen. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up. The tile floor felt cold under my feet. What exactly are you asking me to sign? Nobody answered immediately. That's always the moment you should pay attention to. Chloe finally spoke. It's basically a verification statement. Verification of what? Our operational supply chain. Using my name? Well, yes. I laughed once under my breath. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes your brain needs a second to catch up with how stupid a conversation just became. Dad jumped back in quickly. It's not a big deal. They just want additional credibility attached to the file. Credibility, I repeated. Exactly. I walked toward the desk and opened my laptop fully now. The room smelled faintly like dust and stale air conditioning. Somewhere outside, a couple soldiers were yelling across the parking lot. Meanwhile, my family was apparently trying to recruit me into federal fraud. Who requested this? I asked. The review board flagged inconsistencies, Chloe admitted. What inconsistency? Nothing major. That meant major. I rubbed my forehead slowly. Chloe, federal audits aren't optional. Oh my God, she snapped immediately. You sound like a training manual. Because I work for the federal government. Dad's voice got louder again. Nobody's asking you to break the law. Yes, you are. Silence. Then my mother finally appeared on speakerphone with that careful, soft tone she used whenever she wanted to manipulate a situation without sounding manipulative. Sweetheart, she said gently. Families help each other. There it was. Not facts, not logic. Family, the Hayes family emergency parachute. Pull whenever accountability appears. Mom continued carefully. Your sister worked very hard for this opportunity. So do thousands of audited contractors, I replied. She's under pressure, so are federal investigators. Dad groaned loudly. Jesus Christ, Sarah, why do you always make everything sound criminal? Because you're describing crimes. Chloe cut back in immediately. Nobody is asking you to forge anything. We just need confirmation that our logistics infrastructure meets operational standards. Does it? Another pause. Longer this time. I already knew the answer anyway. I remembered the empty boxes, the fake movement, the mismatched customs tags, the warehouse pretending to be alive. I sat down at the desk and opened a blank notepad out of habit. Dates, times, details. Army life trains documentation into your bones. When's the audit review? I asked. Monday morning, Chloe admitted quietly. And you waited until midnight Thursday to call me. We thought we could handle it internally. Translation. Somebody finally realized they couldn't bluff their way through paperwork. Dad's patience snapped next. You know what your problem is? He barked. You like watching her struggle. I stared at the wall for a second. No, I said calmly. I like staying out of prison. Oh, please. I'm serious. Chloe laughed coldly through the speaker. Nobody goes to prison over compliance forms. That sentence alone told me everything. People who understand federal contracts don't joke like that. I kept my voice steady. If my credentials are attached to false verification documents, that becomes fraud. If military clearance is involved, it becomes much worse. Dad scoffed. There you go again, acting like you're guarding nuclear codes. No, I replied quietly. I'm protecting my career. That hit him wrong immediately. Your career, he repeated bitterly. That dead-end military job? There it was. The real conversation underneath every conversation we'd ever had. To my father, success only counted if it came with visible luxury. Bigger homes, louder cars, expensive watches. Military service confused him because sacrifice without immediate wealth looked like failure to people built like Arthur Hayes. Meanwhile, Chloe had mastered performance. And performance impresses shallow people every time. Dad kept going. You're 34 years old living on base while your little sister's negotiating million-dollar contracts. Preliminary contracts, I corrected automatically. Wrong thing to say. Oh my God, Chloe snapped. You really can't stand seeing me win. Win, interesting word choice. I leaned back slowly in the chair and looked around my tiny room. Metal desk, government furniture, running shoes beside the closet. Half-finished logistics report still open on screen. Nothing impressive, nothing fake either. You need to self-report the audit issues, I said calmly, dead silence. Then everybody started talking at once, Mom pleading, Dad yelling, Chloe cursing under her breath. I waited until the noise burned itself out. Then I spoke clearly enough that nobody could pretend they misunderstood me. Federal audits are not suggestions. If there are discrepancies in your supply chain records, fix them legally. Do not attach my name to anything. Dad exploded. You are unbelievable. No, I said quietly, I'm careful. You want her to fail because your whole life turned into regulations and uniforms and cafeteria coffee. That one almost made me smile. He said cafeteria coffee like it was a moral weakness. Meanwhile, his favorite daughter was apparently one bad audit away from collapse. I moved the phone away from my ear while he kept shouting, mostly insults, some disappointment, a few comments about loyalty. Funny thing about loyalty, people only weaponize it when they need protection from consequences. Finally, I brought the phone back. I'm not signing anything. Mom tried one last time. Sarah, no. Then I hung up. The room went completely quiet after that. No yelling, no ringing. Just the low hum of the air vent above my desk. I sat there for a long minute, staring at my promotion certificate, still leaning against the wall unopened from the drive home. Family teaches you many things. Mine taught me that love is often treated like a debt. But compliance? Compliance is law. The fluorescent lights in my office had a way of making everybody look slightly exhausted. Even the walls looked tired. By 6:40 that morning, I was already halfway through reviewing delayed procurement requests from Fort Stewart when a notification banner appeared across my secure terminal. Verification flag. Action required. I frowned immediately. That wasn't normal. Most flags were harmless credit checks, clearance updates, identity verification, refreshes. The military runs background checks on its own people, so often you stop noticing after a while. But this one had a civilian agency marker attached to it. Department of Defense, Office of Inspector General. Interesting. I clicked the file open while sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup that tasted vaguely like cardboard and regret. The report itself was short, too short. Verification requested regarding secondary employment affiliation. Secondary employment. I sat back slowly. I didn't have secondary employment. The only thing I did outside Army work was occasionally help Lieutenant Brooks lose money in fantasy football. I opened the attachment. Then everything inside me went cold at once. Company name, Hayes Forward Distribution Position listed, Chief Compliance Officer Employee Verification, Major Sarah Hayes. I stared at the screen long enough for my coffee to cool beside my hand. No panic yet, just stillness. The kind your body learns after years in military environments where reacting emotionally before understanding facts can make situations worse fast. I kept reading. Security clearance references, Logistics Oversight Authority, Operational Compliance Certification, and attached beneath it all sat a scanned signature pretending to belong to me. Not even a good forgery. The S in Hayes curved wrong. My actual signature always cuts sharper at the bottom because I fractured my wrist during ROTC training 12 years earlier. Chloe didn't know that. Because Chloe never paid attention long enough to notice real details about other people. My office suddenly felt quieter than usual. I could hear keyboards clicking 3 desks away, somebody laughing softly near the printer, a copier jamming somewhere down the hall. Meanwhile, my entire military career was sitting inside a federal bid package I had never seen before. I printed every page immediately, The printer hummed for maybe 8 seconds. Longest 8 seconds of my life. When the pages slid into the tray, I picked them up carefully and noticed my own rank typed beside fabricated compliance credentials. Major Sarah Hayes. Chief Compliance Officer, Hayes Forward Distribution. I almost laughed again. Not because it was funny, because the alternative was understanding exactly what had happened. They hadn't called asking for help. They'd called because they were already drowning, and they needed me to jump into the water beside them. My office phone rang at 7-3, internal extension. I answered immediately. Major Hayes, a calm male voice responded. This is Agent David Vance with the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General. There it was. Professional voices are terrifying when they don't sound emotional, no anger, no accusations. Just paperwork wearing human skin. Good morning, I replied carefully. We're conducting routine verification procedures connected to Hayes Forward Distribution and associated federal vendor filings. Routine. That word again. Nothing ruins dishonest people faster than routine procedures. Agent Vance continued. Can you confirm your current affiliation with the company? I looked down at the forged document still sitting in front of me. No affiliation. Pause. None at all? None. More typing on his end. Have you ever served as a compliance officer, consultant, contractor, or operational advisor for Hayes Forward Distribution? No. Did you authorize the use of your military credentials within their vendor submission package? No. Another pause. Longer now. Not suspicious. Focused. Agent Vance spoke carefully after that. Major Hayes, for accuracy purposes, are you stating the submitted documentation may contain unauthorized representations of your identity? That's investigator language. Very clean, very controlled. Translation. Did somebody commit fraud using your name? Yes, I answered quietly. I heard typing again, then nothing for a few seconds. You understand, he said calmly, that false statements connected to federal procurement processes carry significant criminal exposure. I understand. Would you be willing to provide formal written clarification? Yes. Thank you, Major. That was it. No dramatic threats. No television-style interrogation. Just facts moving steadily toward consequences. Before hanging up, Agent Vance added one more sentence. For what it's worth, your prompt response is noted. Then the line disconnected. I sat there staring at the receiver in my hand for a long moment. Prompt response. That's military language too. Quiet approval hidden inside bureaucracy. I looked back down at the documents again. This time slower. The entire vendor packet was worse than I realized initially. My forged title appeared 4 separate times. One section claimed I oversaw international sourcing compliance. Another stated I personally verified medical supply chain integrity using Department of Defense standards. They even included partial references to military logistics procedures to make the company appear legitimate. That part almost impressed me, not morally, structurally. Chloe had built a fake credibility bridge out of my actual career, and Dad probably encouraged every second of it. Suddenly, the phone call 3 weeks earlier made complete sense. The desperation, the pressure, the weird vagueness. They weren't trying to gain support. They were trying to retroactively legitimize fraud already submitted under my name. I leaned back in my chair slowly while a hard pressure settled behind my ribs. Not heartbreak exactly. Clarity. That was worse. Because heartbreak still leaves room for misunderstanding. Clarity removes it. I thought about my father calling military promotions charity steps. I thought about Chloe asking if I at least got a decent pay raise. I thought about my mother saying families help each other. Meanwhile, these people had attached my identity to federal documents serious enough to destroy everything I'd spent 12 years building. Security clearance, pension, rank, freedom, honor. All of it exchangeable, apparently, if Chloe needed another warehouse lease and Dad wanted somebody at the country club to brag about. I picked up the printed packet again and flipped to the final page. There sat my fake signature beneath a statement certifying operational legitimacy under federal review. Certified true and accurate. Funny phrase. Because nothing about Hayes Forward was real anymore except the danger. Lieutenant Brooks walked past my office and stopped when he saw my face. You okay? I folded the documents instantly. Fine. He nodded once and kept moving. Military people learn when not to ask questions. I waited until he disappeared down the hallway before opening the packet again. The craziest part wasn't the fraud itself. It was how naturally my family decided I should absorb the risk for them. Like my career existed for their convenience. like my integrity was simply another asset they could borrow temporarily. That realization hurt more than the forgery, because forgery requires planning. This required entitlement. I looked down at my own name one more time printed beneath Chloe's lies, and for the first time in my life, I understood my role inside that family with complete precision. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a shield. The windshield wipers kept perfect rhythm the entire drive north. Click, swipe, click, swipe. 3 hours of rain hitting the hood hard enough to blur headlights into long white smears across Interstate 95. I left Fort Liberty at 2:26 p.m. after signing a 48-hour pass request that technically listed family matters as the reason. Which wasn't wrong, just incomplete. I kept the forged documents inside a manila folder on the passenger seat the whole drive. Every time I stopped at a light, I caught myself glancing at it automatically like it might somehow disappear if I looked away too long. It didn't. Federal fraud has a stubborn way of staying real. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle. Chloe's Range Rover was already there, Dad's Mercedes too. Warm yellow light spilled through the living room windows, making the house look peaceful from outside. Funny how appearances work. I sat in the car another minute listening to the wipers scrape water across the glass. Part of me still wanted this to end differently, not because they deserved protection. Because I wanted proof they still deserved saving. I grabbed the folder and walked to the front door. Mom answered almost immediately. Her face changed the second she saw me, standing there soaked through my jacket. "Sarah, need to talk." She stepped aside nervously without asking questions. The house smelled like expensive candles and pot roast leftovers. Dad sat in the living room, watching cable news with the volume too loud while Chloe scrolled through her phone barefoot on the couch. Nobody looked relaxed. Interesting. Dad muted the television slowly. "What now?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked to the mahogany coffee table he bought 6 years earlier after receiving a commission check from selling luxury RVs. He used to wipe fingerprints off that table like it was a museum artifact. I placed the folder directly in the center. Chloe's face tightened instantly. She recognized it. That told me everything before anybody even spoke. Dad frowned. "What's this?" "Open it," he did. And for the first time in my life, I watched my father lose color in real time, not dramatically, just slowly enough to notice. His eyes moved across the pages while the room stayed completely silent except for rain tapping lightly against the windows. Mom stepped closer. "Arthur?" He ignored her. Chloe stood up too quickly. "Where did you get that?" I looked directly at her. "Department of Defense." Nobody spoke after that, not for several seconds. Dad finally tossed the papers back onto the table like touching them irritated him physically. "So?" I almost laughed. "So." That was his response to felony-level fraud carrying my name and military credentials. "So," I repeated calmly, "you used my identity in a federal vendor submission." Chloe folded her arms immediately. Defensive posture, fast breathing, eyes moving everywhere except toward me. It wasn't supposed to become a huge thing. That's comforting. We needed stronger compliance credibility. "You forged federal documentation." Dad stood up abruptly. "Stop using words like that." "Like what?" "Accurate ones." Mom stepped in carefully. "Sarah, sweetheart, lower your voice." I looked at her in disbelief. I hadn't even raised it. That's how families like mine work. The calmest person in the room somehow becomes the problem because everyone else depends on chaos to avoid accountability. I pulled another copy from the folder and slid it toward Chloe. "You need to withdraw the bid." Her expression hardened instantly. "No. You need to self-report the fraudulent filing." "No. You need to return the preliminary funds before this escalates." Dad slammed his hand against the table hard enough to shake the glasses inside the nearby cabinet. "Absolutely not." The room went still again. I looked at him carefully. "Federal investigators already contacted me." That landed. Mom sat down slowly like her knees stopped cooperating. Chloe's face lost a little more confidence around the edges. "But Dad got angry. That was always his survival mechanism. Some people panic quietly." Arthur Hayes turned panic into volume. "You talked to investigators?" "Yes." "What the hell is wrong with you?" I stared at him for a second, honestly trying to understand the question. "What's wrong with me? You're supposed to protect your family." "No," I said calmly. "I'm supposed to protect my name." Chloe scoffed loudly. "This is unbelievable." "No," I replied, looking directly at her now. Unbelievable was seeing my military credentials attached to fake compliance certifications. They weren't fake. I blinked once. "Chloe, You don't even know how half your warehouse paperwork works. That's not true. You had import tags using outdated customs formatting. Her eyes widened slightly. Good. That meant she remembered the warehouse tour too. Dad pointed toward me aggressively. You've been waiting for this. For what? To tear her down. There it was again. The Hayes family mythology where accountability equals jealousy. I kept my voice level. Federal investigators do not care about family loyalty. Dad laughed bitterly. You think they're going to arrest her over paperwork? I didn't answer, because yes, potentially. And the fact he still didn't understand that terrified me more than the fraud itself. Mom finally spoke softly. Can't this just be corrected quietly? No. Why not? Because the government already has the submission package. Chloe stepped forward now, frustration cracking through her polished CEO act for the first time. You didn't have to confirm anything. I looked at her carefully. That sentence hurt more than it should have. Because she genuinely believed silence would have been loyalty. You used my name, I said quietly. You're my sister. No, I replied. I was your cover story. Dad snatched the papers off the table suddenly. Then he tore them straight down the middle, once, twice, again. Paper fluttered across the expensive hardwood floor while Mom gasped softly beside the couch. There, he snapped. Problem solved. The crazy part? He looked proud of himself. Like destroying copies somehow erased reality. I watched the shredded pages fall around his shoes and realized my father still thought confidence could overpower consequences, the same way it worked on car lots 20 years ago. It couldn't. Not this time. Dad pointed toward the front door. Get out. Mom whispered his name weakly. Arthur. No, he barked. She comes into this house threatening her own family. I warned you. You betrayed us. I picked up my coat slowly from the chair near the entryway. No, I said quietly. I tried to save you. Chloe shook her head with cold disbelief. You really want to destroy everything I built. That sentence almost made me pity her immediately. Because somewhere inside all that performance and ego, Chloe still believed appearances were the same thing as reality. And reality was already catching up fast. Dad opened the front door himself, while rain blew cold air into the hallway. You've always hated seeing her succeed. I paused beside him for a second. Then I looked around the house one last time. The expensive furniture, the staged family photos, the fake calm. All of it balanced on lies thin enough to collapse under basic paperwork. And suddenly my father looked older than I'd ever seen him. Not weak, just fragile. Like a man standing inside a house he still believed was permanent. While smoke quietly filled the walls, I pulled my coat tighter and stepped out into the rain, not angry. That part surprised me most. I didn't leave in anger, I left in mourning. The rain followed me halfway back to Fort Liberty before finally giving up somewhere near Durham. By the time I parked outside battalion headquarters, the sky looked flat and pale, like old printer paper. I slept maybe 3 hours that night. Not because I was emotional. Honestly, emotions would have been easier. What kept me awake was logistics. Timelines, documents, exposure windows. Fraud has structure whether people admit it or not. And once you understand the structure, you understand exactly how badly things can collapse. At 6:15 the next morning, I unlocked my office carrying a manila folder thick enough to make my wrist ache slightly. The building smelled like floor cleaner and burnt coffee. Somewhere down the hallway, a supply sergeant was already arguing with somebody about missing inventory counts. Normal army morning. That helped. Routine keeps panic from becoming theater. I sat down at my metal desk, turned on my secure terminal, and started building distance between myself and my family one document at a time. No dramatic speeches, no revenge fantasies, just paperwork. The first thing I drafted was a formal affidavit for the Office of Inspector General. Name, rank, assignment history, statement of non-affiliation with Hayes Forward Distribution, timeline of discovery. I listed every relevant interaction carefully down to approximate times and locations. The warehouse visit, the late-night phone call, the forged credential submission, my direct verbal refusal to participate. Facts only. People think honesty sounds emotional. Real honesty usually sounds boring. I attached copies of my genuine signatures from prior military documentation so investigators could compare them against the forged submission package. Then I included duty logs proving I was physically on base during several dates. Chloe claims I supervised compliance reviews for her company. That part almost insulted me personally. One document placed me inside a warehouse in Norfolk at 2 p.m. on a Thursday. At 2 p.m. that Thursday, I was standing in 89-degree heat, supervising emergency fuel, rerouting after a generator failure outside Fayetteville. Military records remember everything, which is why smart criminals avoid impersonating government personnel. Chloe was not a smart criminal. She was a confident one. Big difference. By 8:40 a.m., I had submitted the entire affidavit packet through secure channels and received confirmation of receipt from OIG Intake Services. That was the moment it became real. Not emotionally, legally. There's a strange feeling that comes with officially separating yourself from people you love. Nobody talks about it because it sounds colder than it feels. But boundaries are often administrative before they become emotional. I wasn't destroying my family. I was refusing to drown beside them. Lieutenant Brooks stopped by my office around lunch, carrying 2 protein bars and his usual expression of permanent confusion. "You alive?" he asked. Unfortunately, he tossed me a chocolate peanut butter bar. "You missed Ramirez trying to reverse the trailer into Dock 3 this morning. How bad?" He clipped a generator and blamed sunlight. I nodded seriously. Classic sunlight. Brooks smirked. "You okay, though? You've been weird all week." I'm Army weird or civilian weird, federal paperwork weird. That almost made me choke on the protein bar. Almost. "I'm fine," I said. He studied me for a second before shrugging. "All right. But if you snap and start mailing pipe bombs to Congress, at least give me a heads up first." "Fair." He walked off, still chewing beef jerky, while I turned back toward my computer screen. Normal conversations mattered more than people realize during stressful situations. They remind you life keeps moving even while entire sections of your personal world quietly collapse. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing dramatic happened initially. No handcuffs, no screaming phone calls, no television news raid footage. That's the thing people misunderstand about federal investigations. They expect lightning strikes. Real investigations feel more like weather pressure changing slowly, quiet, steady, unavoidable. Meanwhile, my family went completely silent. No texts from Mom. No angry voicemails from Dad. Nothing from Chloe. At first, the silence bothered me. Then it started feeling intentional. Like everyone quietly agreed, I no longer existed unless they needed something from me again. One Friday evening, I made the mistake of opening Facebook after dinner. Dad had uploaded pictures from some country club fundraiser wearing a navy blazer he definitely couldn't afford comfortably. Chloe stood beside him, smiling next to a brand new red Porsche 911 Carrera with a giant white bow across the hood. Caption: "Proud of my girl. Hard work always wins." I stared at the photo longer than I should have. Not because of jealousy. Because I knew exactly how federal investigations work. Somewhere, while my father bragged online about hard work, investigators were probably building transaction timelines and subpoena requests piece by piece inside quiet offices with fluorescent lighting. And they never move quickly at first. That's what makes them dangerous. I closed the app and went back to reviewing transportation manifests. Monday became Thursday. September turned into October. The world kept functioning normally around me while something underneath my family's life slowly cracked wider every day. Occasionally, Agent Vance emailed requesting clarification on dates or signatures. Always polite, always precise, no wasted language. I respected that. One message asked whether I had ever granted verbal authorization for use of my credentials in consultative representation. No. Another asked whether any financial compensation had been offered in exchange for cooperation. No. Another asked whether additional family members appeared aware of the unauthorized representations. That one took me longer to answer, because technically, yes. Emotionally, I didn't want it written down. But eventually, I typed the truth anyway. Truth gets simpler once you stop trying to protect people from consequences. Around mid-October, I received confirmation my security clearance review had been closed without disciplinary findings. I printed the email and folded it into my desk drawer quietly. Not celebration, relief. There's a difference. That night I ran 3 miles around base after sunset while cold air burned through my lungs sharp enough to clear my head. Soldiers smoked outside barracks buildings. Somebody blasted country music from a pickup truck. A helicopter moved across the dark sky slow and steady. Life kept moving. Mine too. And for the first time since finding the forged documents, I realized something important. I had spent years believing silence meant weakness inside my family, but silence can also be separation, distance, protection. A line nobody else notices until they crash into it full speed. I never called investigators demanding revenge. I never leaked information. I never tried to punish Chloe. All I did was tell the truth and step away from the lie. That's the part people rarely understand afterward. I didn't lay a trap. I just stepped off the tracks. The turkey tetrazzini MRE tasted exactly like warm drywall. I sat on the back step outside a temporary training operations trailer at Fort McCoy with a plastic spoon in one hand and cold November, air punching straight through my gloves. Around me, half the unit was pretending Thanksgiving still counted if somebody hung paper decorations near folding tables. It was 2:11 p.m. Somewhere in the distance, generators hummed steadily while soldiers argued over college football picks loud enough to wake wildlife 3 counties away. I checked my phone mostly out of habit. 3 missed calls. Mom. Mom again. Then Dad. Interesting. I almost ignored them. Then another voicemail notification appeared immediately after, and another. I stared at the screen for a second before opening the first message. My mother sounded breathless. Sarah, please call me back. No explanation. Just panic, trying to stay polite. The second voicemail started before I even finished processing the first. Dad this time. His voice already loud. You need to answer your damn phone. I frowned and opened the third message. That's when I heard shouting in the background. Not argument shouting, confused shouting, multiple voices overlapping at once. Then Chloe. Oh my God, the message cut off. I lowered the phone slowly. Around me, soldiers kept laughing near the portable heaters while somebody burned instant coffee inside the trailer kitchenette. Completely normal afternoon. Meanwhile, every instinct in my body suddenly stood up at once. I called Mom back immediately. Straight to voicemail. Dad too. Voicemail again. Then Chloe. Declined. That told me more than any conversation could. I stood up from the concrete step and walked farther away from the others until the noise from the generators softened behind me. Snow flurries drifted lightly across the training grounds without sticking yet. Another voicemail appeared. Unknown number this time. I pressed play. Major Hayes, this is Agent David Vance with the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General. Calm voice, same as always. We executed federal warrants approximately 20 minutes ago connected to the Hayes forward investigation. You are not implicated in the enforcement action. However, due to your prior cooperation, I wanted to ensure you heard that directly from us rather than through secondary channels. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just official. Agent Vance continued carefully. You may receive contact attempts from involved parties over the next several hours. We advise maintaining your prior documented boundaries. Documented boundaries. Even his wording sounded organized. Then the message ended. I stood there alone in the cold for maybe 30 seconds, listening to wind scrape across the empty parking lot. And suddenly, I could see the entire scene happening back home almost perfectly. Thanksgiving at my parents' house always operated like a performance anyway. Too much food, too much alcohol, Dad talking louder with every drink, Chloe treating every gathering like a networking opportunity wrapped in decorative candles. I imagined the dining room first. Catered trays lined across the kitchen island because Chloe hated cooking but loved appearing successful enough to outsource it. Probably expensive wine glasses. Probably jazz music nobody actually liked playing through hidden speakers. Dad installed himself after watching 3 YouTube tutorials and nearly electrocuting the dog. Then the doorbell. 2:30 p.m. exactly. Not the caterer, not neighbors, not friends. 3 federal investigators in windbreakers standing calmly beneath the porch lights while rainwater dripped off the edges of their sleeves. And Agent Vance in the center holding paperwork. Because federal agents don't arrive emotionally, they arrive prepared. My phone rang again suddenly. Dad. I answered this time. The chaos hit instantly. Voices everywhere, furniture moving. My mother crying somewhere farther away. And Dad yelling loud enough to distort the speaker. This is insane. I pulled the phone slightly from my ear. What happened? You know exactly what happened. There was something different in his voice now underneath the anger. Fear. Real fear sounds smaller than people expect. I warned you, I said quietly. Dad ignored that immediately. These people came into my house like criminals. They had a warrant. That doesn't mean. Then another voice interrupted close to the phone. Agent Vance, calm again. Sir, I need you to step away from the evidence table. Evidence table. Jesus. Dad shouted directly over him. My daughter works for the military. I'm aware, Vance replied evenly. She can explain this whole misunderstanding. Long pause, then Vance again. Major Hayes already provided extensive clarification. Silence. Not complete silence. but the kind where somebody suddenly realizes the bridge behind them already burned down weeks ago. Dad spoke again, quieter this time. What did she say? I heard paper sliding across a table. Heavy paper, too. Thick folders, probably the affidavit packet. The signatures, the vendor filings, the timeline, the warehouse photographs, maybe. Truth becomes terrifying once assembled neatly. Then I heard Chloe in the background. No, that's not. Glass shattered suddenly. Wine glass, probably. Nobody reacted dramatically afterward from what I could hear. That part stayed with me later. No screaming investigators, no television-style threats, just movement, paper questions. Reality unfolding calmly while my family finally realized confidence couldn't negotiate with evidence. Dad came back on the line, breathing hard. You gave them everything. No, I said quietly. I gave them the truth. You destroyed her. That one sat with me for a second, because somewhere inside the panic and anger he genuinely believed that. Not Chloe forging credentials, not Chloe filing fraudulent compliance statements, not Chloe using military identity to secure federal contracts. Me, the daughter who refused to lie. I looked out across the gray Wisconsin training grounds, while snow drifted harder now around the parked transport vehicles. Dad, I said carefully, they already had the documents before they ever called me. That's not the point. Of course it wasn't. The point was, I stopped protecting the illusion. In the background, I heard my mother crying again, while Chloe argued with another investigator about attorney access. Then Dad lowered his voice suddenly. Can't you call somebody? There it was, even now, still believing my uniform existed to rescue them from consequences. No, you have connections. I have regulations. Jesus Christ, Sarah. No, I replied quietly. Jesus has nothing to do with federal procurement fraud. That shut him up for maybe 3 full seconds. Long enough for me to hear Agent Vance again, somewhere near the dining room. Please initial beside each seized item acknowledgement. Normal voice, professional voice, the kind that never rises because facts already carry enough weight themselves. And suddenly I pictured my father standing there, surrounded by catered food, expensive decorations, polished silverware, and investigators calmly cataloging evidence on the same mahogany coffee table where he tore my warning in half. Perfect. Almost poetic. But honestly, mostly sad. Dad finally spoke again, and for the first time in my entire life, he sounded old. What happens now? I looked down at the untouched MRE pouch, still sitting beside the concrete step 20 feet away, then back toward the gray horizon. The truth, I said quietly, doesn't need to shout to tear down a house. The first snowfall hit Fort Liberty 2 weeks before Christmas. Not enough to stick properly. Just thin white streaks drifting sideways through cold Carolina wind while soldiers complained dramatically like we were crossing the Arctic instead of walking 20 yards to briefing rooms. Life kept moving. Morning formations, supply requests, fuel reports, coffee strong enough to remove paint. Meanwhile, somewhere several states north, my family's entire world was being dismantled line by line inside federal court filings. I learned most of it accidentally, not through gossip, through paperwork. One afternoon in early December, Agent Vance emailed me a formal notice confirming my status as a non-subject cooperating witness had been finalized. Attached beneath it sat public case references already moving through preliminary federal proceedings. United States v. Chloe Hayes, wire fraud, identity theft. False statements involving federal procurement. Estimated sentencing exposure, 5 to 8 years. I stared at the number longer than I expected. Not because I wanted her protected from consequences. Because prison years sound different once attached to somebody whose bedroom sat 15 feet from yours growing up. I remembered Chloe at 11 years old crying because she accidentally cut our dog's fur uneven trying to help groom him before Mom got home. I remembered her stealing my sweaters in high school because army green looked depressing unless styled correctly. Memory is cruel like that. It never asks whether people still deserve softness before replaying old versions of them. A week later, I found out Dad's financial accounts had been partially frozen pending asset review connected to Chloe's legal defense expenditures and business records. The Porsche disappeared from social media first. Then the country club posts stopped too. Silence replaced performance fast once lawyers entered the room. Funny how quickly luxury becomes unimportant when federal billing hours start stacking. I never contacted any of them, not out of anger, because there was nothing left to say. Then my phone rang on a Thursday night at 8:42 p.m. while I was ironing uniforms inside my quarters. Dad. For a second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello." I barely recognized his voice. Arthur Hayes had always sounded large. Even normal conversations carried this constant salesman energy underneath, like he was trying to close a deal with oxygen itself. Now he sounded thin, tired, old. Sarah, just hearing my name nearly broke him. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed while the iron hissed quietly beside me. "How are you?" I asked. The question came out automatically. Military habit maybe, or humanity. Hard to tell anymore. Dad laughed once. "Not happy." "You really asked that? After all this?" I didn't answer. Because honestly, I didn't know the correct response either. For a few seconds all I heard was breathing and distant television noise somewhere behind him. Then he spoke again, softer. They took not literally, but emotionally, probably yes. "The house? No, not yet. Yet." That word carried more fear than anything else he said. I leaned forward, resting my elbows against my knees. Outside my window, headlights moved slowly past the barracks parking lot, while cold rain tapped lightly against the glass again. Winter rain always sounds lonelier somehow. Dad cleared his throat. "Your mother barely sleeps now." I closed my eyes briefly. "How's Chloe?" Long silence, then finally, "She's scared." "Good." That sounds cruel until you understand something important. Fear was probably the first honest emotion Chloe experienced in years. Dad continued quietly. "The lawyers think maybe if somebody from the military clarified things." There it was. Even now, still reaching toward the uniform, they mocked. "Dad, she made mistakes. She committed federal crimes. She's still your sister." I looked down at the brass oak leaf resting neatly beside my folded jacket on the bed. "Major, the promotion Dad called charity. Funny thing about Army rank. It doesn't care whether your family respects it. The responsibility exists anyway." "She used my identity," I said calmly. "I know. She forged military credentials. I know, and you told me I was jealous." He started crying then, not loud. Honestly, that made it worse. I'd heard my father angry my entire life, heard him arrogant, defensive, drunk proud, but never broken. "She's going to prison," he whispered. The sentence sat between us quietly, no dramatic music, no speeches. Just truth finally arriving after months of denial. I swallowed slowly before answering. "I can't fix this." "Can't you talk to someone?" "There's nobody to talk to. You have connections." I almost smiled sadly at that. He still thought institutions worked like dealerships, like rules bent if you knew the right people. "No," I said gently. "That's not what my uniform is for." Another long silence. Then very quietly, "I didn't understand that before. That one hurt, because part of me believed him. Not completely, but enough." I leaned back against the wall and stared at the ceiling for a second. Cheap government paint. Tiny crack near the smoke detector. Somebody outside laughing too loudly walking toward the parking lot. Regular life continuing again. Dad's voice shook when he spoke next. "You really tried to warn us, didn't you?" "Yes." "I thought you wanted her to fail." "No." "What did you want?" The answer came easier than I expected. "I wanted you to stop lying long enough to save yourselves." I heard him crying again quietly after that. Not dramatic guilt. Just exhaustion. The kind people feel when reality finally becomes too heavy to argue with anymore. After a while, Dad whispered something that stayed with me longer than everything else. I was proud of the wrong things. I looked down at my oak leaf again. The brass caught the room light softly. "You wanted visible success," I said quietly. "I wanted applause." There it was. Finally honest. And honestly, I understood it more than I wanted to. America trains people to confuse attention with worth every single day. Big houses, fancy cars, perfect social media pictures. Meanwhile, integrity looks boring right up until disaster arrives. Dad eventually asked if he could call again sometime. I told him yes. Not because everything was healed, because dignity doesn't require cruelty. When the call ended, I sat there for another minute, listening to the empty room breathe around me. Then somewhere outside, the evening bugle started playing across the parade ground. Clear notes cutting through cold air, steady, certain. I stood up automatically and walked outside into the night with my jacket half buttoned against the wind. Soldiers stopped talking nearby as the music carried across base housing and dark sidewalks. For 12 years, that sound marked endings and accountability and duty all at once. And standing there beneath the winter sky, I finally understood the real weight of the brass oak leaf pinned to my chest. Not authority, not status, responsibility. The kind nobody applauds because it exists when nobody's watching. I touched the metal lightly while the final bugle notes faded into silence. My father spent his whole life chasing admiration people could see. But true honor was never the applause you buy. It was the peace waiting for you when the room gets quiet and you still recognize yourself in the mirror. A lie can build an empire, but only the truth lets you sleep. After everything that happened, I spent a long time thinking about one word my family used constantly: loyalty. Funny thing about loyalty: a lot of people only love that word when they need protection from consequences. My father kept saying I betrayed the family. My mother kept talking about sticking together. Chloe acted like refusing to lie for her was somehow worse than the fraud itself. And honestly, I know a lot of people watching this story probably understand exactly what I mean. Some families don't raise children. They raise emotional employees. Your job becomes protecting the image of the family, no matter how toxic, dishonest, reckless, or manipulative things get behind closed doors. You're expected to stay quiet, stay useful, stay available. And the second you develop boundaries, suddenly you're cold, selfish, or disrespectful. That pattern destroys people slowly. What finally changed my perspective was realizing something simple. Real loyalty does not require self-destruction. If your loyalty can only be proven by sacrificing your integrity, your career, your finances, your peace, or your mental health, that's not love. That's emotional extortion wearing a family label. And families are not the only place this happens. It happens in workplaces too. I've seen people pressured to falsify reports because the team needs it. I've seen employees cover for incompetent bosses out of fear. I've seen grown adults risk prison to protect somebody who wouldn't even answer their calls 6 months later. The scary part is how normal it starts feeling, especially if you grew up around manipulative people. You start confusing guilt with responsibility. That's dangerous. One thing military service taught me very early is that accountability keeps people alive. Rules exist because eventually somebody gets hurt when everyone starts improvising morality for convenience. My family thought I was being dramatic about paperwork. Federal investigators did not. And here's another uncomfortable truth people rarely talk about. Some people only value you when your usefulness benefits them. That realization hurt me more than the fraud itself. Not because I wanted money or praise from my family. Honestly, I stopped expecting that years ago. But somewhere deep down, I still believed they respected my character. Turns out, they respected my credentials more than my humanity. That changes how you see relationships forever. A lot of viewers probably know exactly what that feels like. Maybe you're the responsible sibling, the reliable friend, the person everybody calls during emergencies but quietly ignores when life is good. You become the emotional fire extinguisher for everybody else's chaos. Until one day you realize nobody ever asked whether constantly saving people was burning you alive too. That realization can make you angry for a while. But eventually something healthier replaces the anger. Clarity. And clarity is peaceful. These days, when people ask me what lesson I learned from everything that happened, the answer is actually very simple. Boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are honesty. They tell people where your responsibility ends and theirs begins. And if somebody becomes furious the moment you create boundaries, there's a good chance they were benefiting from your lack of them. That truth alone could save some people years of pain. I also want to say something directly to younger viewers because I wish somebody had told me this earlier. Stop chasing validation from emotionally shallow people. Some parents will never understand your value if it doesn't come wrapped in money, status, or attention. Some siblings will only respect visible success. Some friends disappear the second you stop making their lives easier. That hurts, but it also reveals reality faster. And reality, even painful reality, is still healthier than living inside somebody else's illusion. Because at the end of the day, loyalty without integrity eventually becomes corruption, and love without respect eventually becomes control. One thing I noticed after Chloe's case became public was how many people suddenly acted shocked. Not sad, not reflective. Shocked. Like nobody could believe a confident person with expensive clothes and polished social media photos could possibly be lying. That part honestly fascinates me about modern culture. We trust presentation way too easily. If somebody talks fast enough, dresses expensive enough, and posts enough motivational quotes beside luxury cars, people automatically assume they must be intelligent. Meanwhile, the quiet, disciplined people usually get ignored because competence rarely looks exciting from the outside. Nobody applauds the person who follows procedures correctly for 10 years straight. Nobody makes inspirational documentary about accountants who file accurate reports on time. Nobody posts TikTok montages about warehouse managers who double-check inventory numbers at 6:12 in the morning while drinking terrible coffee out of stained travel mugs. But you know who survives crises? Those people, every time. I spent most of my military career around people the internet would probably call boring. Logistics officers, mechanics, transportation coordinators, fuel specialists, supply clerks. You know what those people actually do? They prevent disasters before anyone notices they almost happened. That's real competence. And real competence usually looks repetitive because stability itself looks repetitive. That lesson applies everywhere in life. Relationships too. Some of the safest people you will ever meet are not flashy. They're not performing intelligence every 5 seconds. They don't need constant attention. They don't treat every conversation like an audition for admiration. They're consistent. And consistency has become weirdly underrated. Meanwhile, people like Chloe survive longer than they should because confidence creates temporary immunity. Especially in America. We love charisma here. We practically treat self-promotion like a personality trait. A confident person can walk into a room and convince everybody they're successful before anyone checks whether the numbers actually make sense. That happens as business constantly. And honestly, it happens in dating too. Some people spend more energy curating the appearance of a stable life than actually building one. Then reality shows up, eventually carrying paperwork. I think that's why my father admired Chloe so much. She looked successful in ways he understood immediately. Fancy watch, luxury car, big contracts, expensive dinners, confident voice. My career looked unimpressive to him because responsibility doesn't photograph well. There are no glamorous Instagram captions for correctly managing fuel movement schedules during emergency deployment preparation. But when things collapsed, the boring systems mattered, documentation mattered, procedure mattered, integrity mattered. That's the irony people miss until life punches them in the mouth financially or emotionally. Discipline feels unnecessary right up until chaos arrives. Then suddenly, everybody starts looking for the responsible person in the room. I also want to say something practical, because this can genuinely help people avoid disasters in real life. Pay attention to whether people's details consistently make sense. That sounds simple, but most people ignore it because confidence distracts them. Honest lives usually survive questions comfortably. Dishonest lives depend on momentum. That's why Chloe hated technical questions at the warehouse. The image mattered more than the structure underneath it. Once somebody started checking the foundation carefully, the performance became harder to maintain. And honestly, a lot of people watching this have probably already experienced some version of that feeling. Maybe with a boss, maybe with a partner, maybe with a family member who always seemed impressive publicly but chaotic privately. The older I get, the more I trust consistency over charisma. Give me the quiet nurse who shows up every shift on time over the influencer selling fake productivity advice online. Give me the mechanic who double-checks brakes instead of the guy bragging about crypto investments at Thanksgiving dinner. Give me the teacher paying bills responsibly instead of the entrepreneur renting luxury cars for social media photos. Because eventually life tests everybody privately, and private reality always wins. That's something my father learned too late. The people he considered boring were the ones sleeping peacefully at night. The people he admired most were drowning quietly behind expensive smiles. The strangest part after everything ended was how quiet life became. Not peaceful immediately, just quieter. No more emergency phone calls, no more family arguments, no more pressure to explain why I refused to participate in somebody else's bad decisions, just silence. And honestly, silence feels uncomfortable when you grow up inside chaos. A lot of people who come from dysfunctional families understand this better than they realize. When your entire childhood revolves around managing other people's emotions, calm can actually feel suspicious at first. You keep waiting for the next explosion, the next guilt trip, the next crisis. Then eventually something strange happens. Your nervous system starts relaxing without asking permission first. I think that was the biggest change for me after Chloe's case ended. Not happiness, relief. There's a difference. Relief is quieter. It shows up in small moments, sleeping through the night without checking your phone, walking into work without wondering whether investigators will call again, hearing your own thoughts clearly for the first time in years, because nobody else's chaos is screaming over them anymore. People love dramatic revenge stories online, big speeches. Public humiliation. Somebody winning while everybody claps. Real life usually doesn't look like that. Real consequences are mostly paperwork, court dates, awkward silences, drained bank accounts, and families sitting in separate rooms during holidays pretending they're just tired. There was no moment where I felt victorious. How could there be? My sister was facing prison. My father looked 20 years older within a few months. My mother developed this nervous habit of apologizing for things nobody even blamed her for. That's not satisfying. That's grief wearing business clothes. And I think people need to hear that more often. Doing the right thing does not always feel good immediately. Sometimes it feels lonely. Sometimes it costs relationships. Sometimes you lose the fantasy version of your family you spent years trying to protect inside your own head. That part hurts deeply. But losing illusions is still healthier than living inside them forever. I also learned something important about self-respect through all this. Self-respect is not loud. It's not arrogance. It's not posting inspirational quotes after cutting toxic people off. Real self-respect is much simpler. It's being able to sit alone in a quiet room without feeling ashamed of your own decisions. That's it. That peace becomes priceless once you experience it. I still think about my father sometimes when the evening bugle plays across base. Not angry thoughts, mostly sad ones. Because underneath all his pride and obsession with appearances, I think he genuinely believed success would finally make him feel secure. A lot of people believe that. More money, more status, bigger house, more impressive children. But insecurity doesn't disappear just because the packaging improves. And if your entire identity depends on appearances, eventually reality becomes terrifying. That's why integrity matters so much. Integrity gives you somewhere solid to stand when everything external starts collapsing. Without it, people panic the second consequences arrive. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who currently feels trapped between keeping peace and protecting themselves. Choose honesty early, not brutally, not cruelly, but clearly. The longer you tolerate manipulation, dishonesty, or emotional pressure, the more expensive the consequences become later. And please understand this. You are not required to destroy yourself just because somebody shares your last name. That lesson took me years to learn. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in somebody's self-destruction, even when they hate you for it, especially then. These stories matter because a lot more people live through situations like this than society admits openly. Families built on image, relationships built on guilt, loyalty used like a weapon, good people pressured into compromising themselves to protect someone else's illusion. If any part of this story felt painfully familiar, I hope you remember one thing moving forward. Temporary approval is never worth permanent regret. And eventually, every adult has to decide whether they want applause from dishonest people or peace within themselves. Thank you for staying through this entire story. And if you enjoy emotionally real stories about family, dignity, boundaries, consequences, and the complicated reality of human relationships, subscribe to the channel. There are a lot more conversations like this coming, some painful, some uncomfortable, but all honest.